Hey guys, tonight we drift into the tangled vines of ancient Greece, where gods occasionally get drunk, sleep for 3 days straight, and talk to grapes. You're headed to the sleepy woods of Nysa, a mythical land that sounds like a resort, but is more like the divine version of a chaotic startup. Tonight's journey is soft and slow, soaked in red wine and fuzzy goat hair, and centered around a story so low stakes you could almost doze through it, which is exactly the point. You're going to meet Dionysus, god of wine, questionable decisions, and really enthusiastic dance parties. And yes, this is the story where he gets mysteriously stuck in a vineyard for 3 entire days. Did he pass out? Was it magical ivy? Did the grapes unionize? Scholars don't agree, but one thing is certain. You probably wouldn't survive it. Too many satyrs, not enough bathrooms. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The trees are tall here in Nysa, not the kind you see in your backyard. These ones hum slightly in the breeze, thick with curling leaves and flowering vines. The air smells like overripe figs and slightly damp theater curtains. Somewhere in the underbrush, something with hooves is snoring gently. You step carefully between fallen olive pits and crushed pomegranates, your sandals sticking just a little with every step. The sun is soft, not golden, more like the lazy glint of wine in a clay cup. And then, at the edge of the vineyard, you see him, Dionysus. Or rather, you see a puddle of purple fabric, tangled hair, and one arm draped over a gourd-shaped wine jug that is most definitely not empty. His snores are faint but steady. There's ivy in his beard. A squirrel is using him as shade. You tilt your head. He hasn't moved in a while. The vines around him sway a little more than the others, as if they're whispering about their slumbering creator. And this vineyard, it doesn't look like any agricultural layout you've ever seen. The rows are wonky, looping like doodles in a bored philosopher's notebook. Some grapes glow faintly. One even winks at you. You decide to ignore that. The story of how Dionysus ended up here starts unsurprisingly with a complicated family drama. Hera, the queen of the gods, was not thrilled when her husband Zeus went off and fathered Dionysus with a mortal woman named Semele. Classic Olympus, really. Hera, in a fit of divine pettiness, arranged for Semele to perish spectacularly before Dionysus was even born. Zeus managed to save the fetus by sewing it into his own thigh, because apparently that's a thing. And thus, Dionysus came into the world a little premature and a lot confused. You step lightly through the vines as the breeze thickens with the scent of crushed rosemary. Dionysus mutters something about leopard slippers in his sleep. As a baby, Dionysus couldn't exactly hang around Mount Olympus without attracting Hera's wrath. So Zeus shipped him off, like divine mail, to be raised in secret. The location? These very woods. Nysa. Part forest, part hallucination, all magical babysitting center. The residents were eclectic. Nymphs with long memories and longer to-do lists. Satyrs with more enthusiasm than hygiene. A snake or two. Maybe a goat that reads poetry. Historians still argue whether Nysa was a real location, a metaphor for psychedelic self-discovery, or just a way to explain how a toddler god learned to ferment things. The vineyard rustles behind you as if chuckling. You crouch beside Dionysus and peer at his face. He looks peaceful. A little flushed, sure, but he's not drooling, which is more than you can say for some of the satyrs nearby. One of them stirs in the distance, murmuring about the great cheese feast of last Thursday. You wonder briefly what it takes to count as a great feast in a place where grapes grow themselves and olives sparkle when nobody's watching. The air is getting thicker now, the sun lower. This isn't the kind of vineyard where you harvest anything on time. It's the kind where time slows down, leans against a tree, and joins the gods in a nap. You begin to understand why Dionysus never left. There's a humming in the vines, soft and rhythmic, like a lullaby in another language. You pause to listen. It's probably just the wind, or maybe the grapes singing a little. You make a note to ask one later if it opens its eyes again. Of course, there's also the theory that Dionysus didn't choose to stay here for 3 days. That maybe, just maybe, someone or something kept him here. Some scholars point to the ivy. It's magical, after all. It grew from his footprints. In some versions of the myth, the vines rebelled, curling around him while he slept, too enchanted by their maker to let him go. Others think it was divine exhaustion, or a drunken nap with delusions of grandeur. No two versions agree, but as you settle into the grassy slope beside him, watching the flicker of fireflies begin their soft evening dance, you start to think. Maybe it doesn't matter. Whether spell or sleep, hallucination or hangover, the point is he's here. The god of wild joy, theatrical flair, and fermentation, sleeping like a baby in the land that raised him. You reach down and pluck a single grape from the nearest vine. It tastes like honey. You glance once more at Dionysus, still out cold, and decide you've got time. Time to backtrack, to trace the soft spiral of his story from the start. Because before he was a grape-stained nap enthusiast, he was a surprisingly well-traveled baby with the worst case of divine custody drama in all of Olympus. It starts with a boom, literally. Dionysus's mother, Semele, made the classic mistake of dating Zeus without checking Hera's mood calendar. Hera, not one to let betrayal slide, tricked Semele into asking Zeus to reveal his true god form. Spoiler, this never goes well. When Zeus complied, Semele was instantly incinerated in a flash of divine light and ego. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic of human frailty in the face of divinity, or just Zeus being a reckless boyfriend. But Zeus, in a rare moment of paternal guilt, saved the unborn Dionysus by stitching him into his own thigh. Yes, his thigh. You try not to picture the logistics. 9 months later, or however time works in Olympus, Dionysus was born from Zeus's leg, wailing and wine-scented. Now, here's the thing. Hera still wasn't thrilled, and Zeus, knowing his wife could hold a grudge longer than an immortal with a broken harp, knew he couldn't raise this kid in the open. So he outsourced. And like all great outsourcing jobs, it came with inconsistencies, conflicting timelines, and at least 3 versions of who actually raised the child. First up, the nymphs of Nysa. Think gentle forest ladies with lullabies and access to magical vines. They supposedly rocked Dionysus to sleep under fig trees and fed him honey drizzled with dream dust. It's a sweet version. But then there's the one involving Ino, Semele's sister, who disguised Dionysus as a girl to hide him from Hera's all-seeing rage. He apparently lived with her family for a while, wearing dresses and learning to walk like a Theban noblewoman. A choice. One he might have appreciated later when theatrical flair became his trademark. Then there's the weird one. Because of course there's a weird one, where the baby Dionysus was turned into a goat. Or maybe a baby goat was turned into Dionysus. Either way, someone bleated, and depending on who tells the story, he may have been hidden in a cave guarded by bees. Buzzing, loyal bees. Honestly, you wouldn't be surprised if one flew past your ear right now, humming some ancient lullaby about nectar and secrets. The forest floor beneath your feet is soft with old leaves and wine-soaked soil. You imagine a tiny Dionysus crawling across it, his baby hands sticky with grape juice and mischief. He probably didn't care where he was as long as he wasn't being vaporized. Of course, growing up on the run had its effects. Unlike his fellow gods, Dionysus didn't strut around Olympus with a lightning bolt and a superiority complex. He was shaped by forests, foster homes, and the kind of parties that start with flute music and end with a goat passed out in a garland pile. His divine portfolio wasn't about war or wisdom. It was about joy, excess, and the blurry line between pleasure and chaos. Still, not everyone was thrilled about his ascension. The older gods saw him as eccentric, a little too fond of mortals, a little too glittery. He didn't smite people with plagues. He handed them fermented drinks and invited them to dance. And yet, people followed him. They always did. As you meander farther into the vineyard, the vines begin to whisper again, soft voices in a language you almost understand. You spot an abandoned baby rattle half buried in the soil. It's shaped like a thyrsus, a staff tipped with a pine cone, wrapped in ivy, classic Dionysian branding. You pick it up. It smells faintly of fennel and festival nights. Back in the clearing, Dionysus rolls over and wraps his arms around the wine jug like it's a teddy bear. A frog hops over his foot. He doesn't wake. So, how exactly does a divine toddler become a symbol of wine-soaked transcendence? One footstep at a time, apparently. Dionysus grew up wandering, not just through Nysa, but across the ancient world. Egypt, Syria, Phrygia, even India, according to some fabulously unverified myths. He collected customs like souvenirs. In Phrygia, he met the goddess Cybele and learned the art of ecstatic ritual. In Egypt, he picked up headdresses and arguably some eyeliner tips. Historians still debate whether these travels reflect actual cultural exchange or just Greek attempts to exoticize their own deities. Regardless, Dionysus wasn't a homebody. He was a collector of sensations, a connoisseur of noise, laughter, and masks. While the other gods held court on Olympus, Dionysus was out in the hills, dancing with nymphs and goats, shouting at the moon, and sometimes turning pirates into dolphins, because why not? You pause at a cluster of particularly plump grapes. They glisten as if freshly washed, even though no one's touched them in centuries. You pluck one and let it burst on your tongue. The taste is oddly nostalgic, like a party you never attended but still somehow remember. And yet, underneath all that revelry was something quieter. Dionysus at his core was a god of transformation, of losing oneself to find something deeper. He wasn't just the wine, he was the intoxication, the surrender, the fog between reality and vision. His worship wasn't about luxury, it was about release. Which brings you gently back to this moment. Dionysus, lying like a forgotten sculpture, his cheek resting on a patch of moss, remains deeply asleep. Around him, the vineyard pulses with a heartbeat not your own. The grapes sway, the leaves rustle. A tiny breeze curls through the trees like a whispered joke. Somewhere, a satyr coughs in his sleep. You sit down beside the god and let your head fall back against a twisted trunk. You're starting to understand the rhythm of this place, the way it stretches time like dough. Maybe Dionysus didn't get stuck. Maybe he chose to let go for a while. Maybe the real miracle isn't the wine or the madness, but the nap. And really, who could blame him? The sun overhead does what it always does in sleepy myths like this. It forgets to move. Or at least it seems that way. The vineyard remains in a sort of wine-colored stasis, golden light filtering through the leaves like warm honey. You're starting to wonder whether time has simply gone off duty here, pulled up a chaise lounge and poured itself a goblet of something red and slow. Meanwhile, Dionysus snores softly, one sandal still dangling precariously off his foot. It's a peculiar sight for a god. No thunderbolts, no flaming chariots, just a barefoot nap with grape juice stains down the front of his robe. And yet, oddly fitting. You let your gaze wander again through the vineyard's lazy sprawl. If Dionysus is the god of wine and revelry, you wonder, where exactly did that association begin? Was he always the life of the party? Or did he, like so many of us, become the wine guy by accident? Turns out it wasn't exactly an accident. It was more of an obsession. Dionysus didn't invent wine, but according to myth, he definitely refined it. The earliest tales place him discovering the power of the grape somewhere in the rocky hills of Thrace or maybe in Lydia. He crushed a few grapes, left the juice in a bowl overnight, came back the next day, and boom, fermentation. Or, as he might have called it, divine surprise juice. Now, here's your mainstream historical fact. Wine production in ancient Greece actually began around 2000 BCE, with winemaking tools and amphorae found all over the Mediterranean. It was deeply tied to trade, religion, and everyday life. Drinking wine wasn't just social, it was spiritual. And Dionysus, being the god with the best branding sense, latched onto that vibe immediately. Of course, he didn't keep the discovery to himself. What would be the point of having wine if not to share it with wide-eyed shepherds and overworked peasants? And so Dionysus began his famous wanderings, spreading the gospel of grape across the known world. He traveled with an entourage, a band of satyrs, monads, and one very confused donkey. They moved like a traveling circus through sleepy mountain villages, handing out goblets and converting skeptics with a single sip. Imagine it, a dusty little town where nothing ever happens, and suddenly a divine figure with ivy in his hair shows up, smiling like he knows the end of every joke. He pours you something sweet and strong. You take a sip. The air changes, the sky tilts slightly. Your neighbor starts dancing, and suddenly you get it. Historians still argue whether Dionysian cults reflect ancient rites of seasonal fertility or elaborate social rebellion in disguise. But to the villagers, it was probably simpler. Dionysus made the world taste better. As you stroll past another trellis, you spot a tiny amphora wedged into the soil like it grew there. You kneel down and brush the dirt off gently. The clay is warm and it smells faintly of resin and wild thyme, probably a vintage from 800 BCE. Now, not everyone loved Dionysus's little vineyard revival tour. There were kings, priests, and uptight city-states who didn't appreciate spontaneous dancing in the marketplace. One famous example, King Pentheus of Thebes, who famously tried to ban Dionysian rites, calling them a corrupting influence. Dionysus responded with theatrical flair. He disguised himself, lured the king into the woods dressed as a woman, and, well, let's just say Pentheus didn't make it back for supper. The moral? Never try to out-theater the god of theater. But let's not dwell on the sharp edges. Instead, imagine Dionysus reclining on a leopard skin throw, swirling a goblet, his eyes twinkling with lazy delight. He's more than just a god. He's the ultimate vibe. And vibe he did. His cults began to spread not just through Greece, but into Rome, Asia Minor, and beyond. There were temples, secret rituals, and midnight festivals where followers, especially women, would dance under moonlight, possessed by something older and wilder than society allowed. These weren't chaotic raves, they were sacred release, a letting go of all the things people carried too tightly. You take a deep breath. The air here is thick with lavender and old stories. A chorus of cicadas hums softly in the background, like a lullaby for tired gods. And speaking of tired gods, Dionysus mumbles something in his sleep. Maybe a poem, maybe a wine order. Then he rolls onto his other side and knocks over a nearby bunch of grapes, which fall like soft marbles onto the moss. You watch a snail crawl leisurely over his sandal strap. Despite the softness of this scene, you know Dionysus had his harder days. His road to full Olympian status wasn't smooth. For a long time, the other gods didn't even recognize him as one of their own. He was too weird, too emotional, too fun. There's a story, one of many, about how Hera drove him mad, and he wandered the earth, lost and out of his mind. Some versions say he stumbled into Egypt during this period. Others say he ended up inventing theater to cope. The scholarly consensus? Unclear. But it's widely agreed that Dionysus represents duality, joy and madness, freedom and frenzy, the sweetness of wine and the burn beneath. And maybe that's why you're here. To sit in this liminal vineyard beside a god who once didn't know his own name, and listen to the grapes whisper about things that don't quite make sense but still feel true. The wind stirs again, rustling the vines like gentle applause. You lean back and close your eyes for a moment. It's tempting, very tempting, to nap here forever. To let the wine god's dream pull you under where everything smells like fennel and moonlight, and the rules of time dissolve like sugar in warm tea. But not yet. You still want to know how he got stuck here for 3 days. That part's coming. For now, the story continues to swell like a rising tide. Sweet, strange, and surprisingly soothing. You open your eyes again to a vineyard still suspended in its own slow rhythm. Nothing has changed, and yet everything seems a little different. Dionysus now has one arm flung dramatically over his face, as though he's just been told his favorite wine was discontinued. You're not sure whether he's dreaming, sulking, or composing a tragic chorus in his head. All three seem plausible. You move deeper into the vines, careful not to trip over a sleeping satyr who's snoring into a basket of half-crushed grapes. You pause. This might be a good time to ask, what exactly is a satyr? Here's your mainstream fact. Satyrs are mythical creatures tied to both Greek and Roman mythology, often associated with nature, mischief, and, of course, wine. Half man, half goat, they were Dionysus's ever-present companions, bringing music, dance, and a shocking lack of personal boundaries to every event. In early Greek art, they looked more like wild men with horsetails. Later, they gained goat legs and pointy ears. What satyrs lacked in manners, they made up for in enthusiasm. Picture a woodland bachelor party thrown by overly emotional jazz musicians. That's the vibe. Anyway, this one, let's call him Mopsos, is dreaming of something cheerful because he's smiling in his sleep and humming off-key. You tiptoe around him only to nearly trip over yet another surprise. A statue. Half buried in vines, moss growing up its leg, it's a weathered stone of Dionysus himself, though with a much prouder posture than the real version currently drooling into the grass. You brush some ivy away and notice the base of the statue has an inscription. You can't read it, ancient Greek maybe, but someone's also scratched in a newer message underneath. Please don't wake the god unless you brought snacks. You chuckle. A little. Quietly. Now, about this vineyard and why Dionysus can't leave it. The answer lies in one of the stranger side stories of his mythology, one historians still puzzle over. At some point in his eternal wanderings, Dionysus stumbled upon a region said to grow the richest, darkest grapes in all of Thrace. The locals welcomed him with polite smiles, but refused to share their harvest, claiming it wasn't ready. Suspicious, right? Dionysus, being the god of wine, took that as a challenge. He walked straight into the vineyard and said something along the lines of, "I'll just test a few." For quality control. Then he disappeared inside. That was day one. He sampled some grapes, then more grapes, then he started talking to the grapes. Then somehow the vineyard stopped letting him leave. Was it enchanted? Did he curse himself accidentally in a moment of dramatic flair? Or, and this is very possible, did he just forget why he went in there in the first place? Historians still argue whether this was a punishment, a mystical trance, or just a metaphor for self-indulgence. But the myth is clear. For 3 full days, Dionysus wandered in circles, tipsy and muttering, unable to find the exit. And while we're pondering that, here's your quirky tidbit of the evening. In some lesser-known Orphic versions of Dionysus' story, he's called Zagreus, a shadowy underworld version of himself. These myths suggest he was born twice, once as the son of Persephone, then reborn as the Dionysus we know. 2 births, 2 lives, 1 vineyard. Whether trapped or entranced, Dionysus spent those 3 days wandering under a never-setting sun, tasting each grape like it was a riddle. Satyrs tried to help, but mostly ended up getting lost too. Maenads left offerings at the edge of the vines. A few local shepherds tried to call him out, only to be told he couldn't come until he found the correct note in the wine song. Classic Dionysus. Everything had to be poetic. Some modern interpretations say the vineyard wasn't physical at all, but a dreamscape, a mental spiral. Dionysus wasn't stuck in a field. He was stuck in his own divine hangover. You have to admit, that would make a lot of sense. He does look like someone trying to remember whether he left the stove on in 500 BCE. Still, you can't help but wonder if there was more to this place. The vineyard doesn't just feel old, it feels alive. The way the vines curl toward the sunlight like sleepy fingers. The way the soil smells like history and secrets. And the way every grape you taste seems to whisper a different name. You pluck one now, rolling it between your fingers. It's soft, warm, impossibly fragrant. You pop it into your mouth, and suddenly, just faintly, you hear distant flute music. A breeze passes through. Maybe it's nothing. Or maybe you've just passed some sort of test. Meanwhile, Dionysus stirs again, this time sitting up. He blinks at you blearily. His hair's full of leaves. His robe is halfway off one shoulder. He looks like someone who woke up halfway through their own surprise party. Is it Tuesday? He mumbles, then flops back down again. You decide not to answer. Instead, you look out over the rows and rows of vines. They stretch farther than seems physically possible, twisting up hillsides around stone columns, disappearing into the haze. Somewhere out there is an exit. Maybe. Or maybe you're meant to stay a while. After all, there are worse places to be stuck than in the company of a sleepy god and his grape-addled crew. The sky shifts subtly. A few birds drift past lazily, too slow to bother naming. And the story continues. Softly, slowly, winding like ivy through ancient memories.